Imagine for one moment, if you can, what it must have been like to be a Viking. A battle at sea, the sound of steel on steel, the smell of blood in the air. Yet through all of the chaos, we see one man standing still, adrift in this dreamlike state, thinking of his family, those people that he loves dearest. This is the legendary Viking Thors, and while a short-lived character in our story, his importance cannot be understated. Suddenly, though, Thors is pulled away from this paradise of his family to the hell of his existence. Thors, the Troll of Yom, was no stranger to the battlefield. A fierce Jomsviking warrior, Thors had developed a reputation as one of the fiercest Viking warriors alive. And whether Thors knew it or not, this would be one of his final battles. He knew this was the moment he would leave this life behind. He would swim to shore, abandoning the battlefield. There would be no sign of Thors' body, but he knew his comrades would assume that he was dead, as the great Thors would never run from a fight. They would never understand this was the only way he could finally leave his life behind, as Thors, the Troll of Yom, walked away from his Viking life of violence and death forever. If only this would be the case. Vinland Saga is one of those animes that's really just so much more that meets the eye. Anime, you see, can serve a variety of purposes. Usually, first and foremost, it's, well, entertainment in some kind of fashion. Whether it's slice of life, isekai, romance, or just a classic shonen battle anime. All of them provide us with some form of entertainment and escape from our, well, rather mundane realities. Not all art serves a purpose. More often than not, entertainment is really the sole purpose of a given anime or manga. Vinland Saga, however, is something so much more than this. The show draws you in with this allure of a violent historical fiction story, a depiction of the great Vikings of Denmark whose influence would reach as far as England. However, this show, over its many episodes, slowly transforms to this critique on the human existence. Over the last few years, Vinland Saga has become really one of my favorite pieces of media probably ever. It's a story about family, love, purpose, violence, what it means to be human, the most beautiful and ugly parts that make us so, and it's just fucking brilliant, man. You see, Vinland Saga is freaking brutal. I mean really brutal. At times, this anime can be, well, extremely uncomfortable to watch, but you see, it's through this uncomfortable violence that Vinland Saga gives its message on the cyclical nature of the human existence. And I think that, really, no moment embodies this more than this scene that came from Season 2, where our main protagonist, Thorfinn, lets a guy punch him in the face 100 times. Makoto Yukimura, the author of Vinland Saga, is not like a lot of your other traditional manga artists. Inspired by Fist of the North Star at a young age, Yukimura said he always dreamed of making a series that would reflect this anime's theme of strength and justice. Something that I believed he has achieved, but probably not in the original way that he set out. Yukimura, you see, as an author and manga artist, was highly influenced by his upbringing. A child of the Cold War, Yukimura describes his feelings during his childhood as one of uneasiness, a feeling that was probably shared by many throughout the world, as from the end of World War II all the way up to the fall of the Berlin Wall in the mid-90s, the world existed in a constant state of anxiety as tensions constantly boiled between the United States and the Soviet Union, with their prospective allies all mixed up in between. Proxy wars were fought really across the entire world, and the threat of nuclear war was ever present in basically everyday life, as any day it felt like the US or the Soviet Union could suddenly start an all-out war that probably would have ended humanity. We flash forward to September 11th, 2001, the attack on the World Trade Center in New York. Yukimura was 25 at the time, steadily working on his debut manga work, the science fiction story Planetes, which would be serialized in a weekly morning magazine from 1994 all the way up until 2004. This moment, though, and the subsequent years of war that would follow had a profound effect on Yukimura most namely his writing. Since a young age, Yukimura had said he was always fascinated by Vikings. After watching the series Vicky the Viking as a young boy, here would be the catalyst for Yukimura's magnum opus, Vinland Saga, a story deeply inspired by Yukimura's own perception and trauma of violence from his life and experiences on this planet. As I stated earlier, Vinland Saga is insanely brutal. Its depictions of violence are so real and horrifying at times that it really makes you take a step back. You see, when asked about the level of violence in his manga, Yukimura stated that he personally detests violence. Thus, it was important for him to show the true realities of violence in his work, as it reflected the real world he had grown up in, and really is a far cry from a lot of other classic shonen battle anime, or really any anime that it has violence in it. Vinland Saga follows the story of Thorfinn, a young boy who, after witnessing the death of his Viking father, vows to avenge him by becoming a fierce warrior. He leaves everything and everyone he loves and knows behind, joining the mercenary Ashkelad, the man who killed his father, as he vows to Thorfinn that one day, when he becomes strong enough, he will offer him a duel, a chance for Thorfinn to take his revenge. Oh yeah, he's like 8, by the way. Our story begins in the cold wasteland of Iceland. Here we are introduced to the Viking warrior Thors and his family, his friend and adventurer Leif Erikson, his wife Elga, his daughter Ylva, and his young son Thorfinn. Through Leif Erikson's stories, we understand the state of the world. To the south is the country of Norway, ruled by a powerful Viking, Harald, who began conquering this land, declaring himself the first king of Norway. The king would force the people of Norway to choose, obey him or leave the country forever. Leif's ancestors, fearing Harald's violence, would leave Norway, settling in their new icy home, the country of Iceland, which they hoped would be free from Harald's violence. Spoiler alert. It wasn't. One day, the family's sleepy life in Iceland changes when an escaped slave makes his way to Thorfinn's village, the man passing out and nearly dying from the cold. Thors works tirelessly to make sure the man lives. The following day, the slave's owner, the Viking Halfdan, arrives with his fighters, demanding to know if his property is there. In this really short interaction we see between two very minor characters, an argument takes place between one of the villagers and Halfdan's man, the man claiming the villager had cut his arm off during a fight, the villager replying, "How dare you cut off my brother's leg?" Such a small little throwaway line and dialogue scene that's in the first 20 minutes of episode 1, but right here in this interaction, our author Yukimura is telling us exactly what Vinland Saga is all about. A cycle of violence, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a never-ending cycle, a snake forever eating its tail. In many ways, this is exactly what Vinland Saga is all about. Throughout our story, we see Thorfinn change from this small, young, innocent boy to a cold, ruthless, and brutal killing machine, all while being a child. Again, he's 8, by the way. The catalyst for all of this being the arrival of Floki, the leader of the Jomsvikings, former allies to the Viking Thors, Thorfinn's father. Floki tells Thors that a war will soon break out across the lands of Europe. The sister of the King of Denmark has been killed by English soldiers, and the warring king, King Sven, will certainly want revenge. As they prepare for an all-out invasion of England, Floki tells Thors that even though he had deserted 15 years prior, he will be participating in this war, something that Thors reluctantly accepts. The following day, we see Thors set out with a ship and his group of inexperienced warriors, but to his sadness, his son Thorfinn is nowhere to be seen. He is not there to see the man off to war, only to find out that the young boy has stowed himself away on his father's warship and is now seemingly going to England to experience war with his father. Unbeknownst to Thors and Thorfinn, though, he is sailing right into a trap. Floki has hired the warrior Ashkelad and his band of mercenaries to assassinate Thors, the man never liking Thors and never forgiving him for deserting 15 years prior, as Thors and his companion sail right into a death trap. Thors, realizing they are outnumbered and knowing his soldiers are inexperienced, can really only do one thing. He must become the man he swore he would never be. Once again, he must become Thors, the Troll of Yam, as he goes absolutely Giga Chad mode, beating the piss out of these warriors. Still, after defeating so many men, Thors and his allies are outnumbered. In one final ploy, Thors challenges Askeladd to a duel to decide the fate of his men. Askeladd accepts, the two men engaging one another. Thors, being the superior swordsman, along with having the superior strength, because he is a big boy, begins to overwhelm Askeladd, who can do nothing but block the larger man's attacks. Thors manages to disarm Askeladd, besting him in the duel. But you see, Askeladd is not a man of honor. The man had never planned on respecting the duel from the very beginning. He only wanted to know how strong Thors was, as one of Askeladd's men takes Thorfinn hostage, as Askeladd gives the signal for his archers from above to rain down arrows upon the great Viking man. Thorfinn looks on in horror as he watches his father die before his very eyes. His grief consuming him, Thorfinn refused to accept that Askeladd can live while his father dies. His anger slowly consuming him, Thorfinn, at only the age of 8 or 9, makes a vow. He will kill Askeladd no matter what. No matter how long it takes, he will be the one to take revenge. With nothing left and just being a young boy, Thorfinn's mind completely shatters. He becomes consumed by the want for revenge. Amused by this, Askeladd tells Thorfinn to train, to achieve greatness on the battlefield like his father, and then, maybe one day, he will reward the child with a duel, a chance to take his revenge. Thorfinn would spend the next 11 years with Askeladd and his band of mercenaries, the boy slowly becoming a skilled, cold, calculating warrior, the young man taking his first life when he was only 9 years old. Thorfinn continues to take countless number of lives, committing horrible acts of violence and atrocities. Slowly, he begins to come numb to the outside world, really as a way of shielding his young mind from the horrible acts that he is committing. Thorfinn becoming distant and cold, the boy basically never smiling, a far cry from the joyful young man he once was. One of the more brutal moments of Season 1 and Thorfinn's violence comes when Thorfinn, after being injured in England, is taken in by an English family, only to betray them, setting fire to the village as a signal for Askeladd and his Viking forces to attack, the village being completely destroyed, which we'll see will forever haunt Thorfinn. Thorfinn, in his time spent in England, continues to grow as a warrior, eventually his band saving Prince Canute, the heir to Denmark and now England, Thorfinn being made a member of Canute's private guard. Thorfinn is finally spared a moment from the violence and death when, after years apart in really a chance meeting, he sees his father's old friend, Leif Erikson, who has been searching for Thorfinn this entire time. Leif pleads with Thorfinn to come home, saying he's done more than enough. Thorfinn, hardened by battle and his hatred, scoffs at this idea, saying as long as Askeladd is alive, it will never be enough. In a brutal final moment of Season 1, we see Askeladd murder King Svein, Canute's father, in an attempt to save his home country of Wales, which King Svein was planning on invading. Eventually, after murdering the king, Askeladd allows himself to be struck down by Prince Canute in order to legitimize Prince Canute as a warrior. Thorfinn arrives to this scene just in time to see Askeladd dying, the rage building inside of him as he realizes in this moment this revenge he has spent the last 11 years pursuing, the thing that he has spent his entire life for, was now out of his reach. With his dying breath, Askeladd chastises the young Thorfinn, saying he never thought of a life past Askeladd's death. He tells him to go, to be Thor's son, to become a true warrior like his father. Then there's this moment that's arguably one of the best scenes in this entire series. Just take a gander at the look on Thorfinn's face, this look of pure agony, as he struggles to come to terms with what has just happened. In a moment of fury and grief, Thorfinn strikes out at Prince Canute, cutting his face. Because of their relationship, Canute spares Thorfinn, the young man being sold forever into a life into slavery. And you see, that's kind of the funny thing about Vinland Saga. Season 1, in a lot of ways, is really, well, it's just a setup It's a prequel arc for the events of Season 2 and beyond, something that anime-only fans might have been a little surprised by, especially considering the dramatic tone shift into Season 2. Episode 1 of Season 2 of Vinland Saga had a lot of fans confused, as, well, basically the entirety of the episode follows the story of a new character, Einar, an Englishman whose home has been conquered and destroyed by Vikings, who now finds himself being sold into slavery on a farm in Denmark. And then, with just 1 minute left in this episode, Einar is introduced to one of his fellow slaves, as we see a somewhat older and more ragged Thorfinn, the fire in his eyes long gone, come walking out of the woods. Over the next few episodes, we begin to see Einar slowly adjust to his life as a slave on the farm with Thorfinn. We see that Thorfinn is a complete shell of the former man that he once was, and that over his last 3 years of being imprisoned as a slave, Thorfinn has seemingly lost all of his will to live. We juxtapose this with Einar, a man who detests war and violence after what it has done to him and what it has done to his people. As in episode 1, we brutally see Einar lose his mother as well as his sister in a Viking raid. And to Einar, their sacrifice was really all the more reason for him to continue living. In episode 3 of season 2, we see a glimpse into the trauma that Thorfinn is dealing with as Einar witnesses one of Thorfinn's many repeated night terrors. You see, in a lot of ways, the story of Vinland Saga is one of redemption and purpose. Thorfinn has lost himself and is beginning to suffer mentally for all of the pain that he has caused in his life. Imagine, just for a second, if you even can, being a young man, a young boy, with so much anger and hatred and want for revenge that you would willingly sign up to work with your father's killer in a hope that one day you could take your revenge. For years, you work as a mercenary, growing stronger as a warrior, but you're still just a little boy. But yet, so much blood is on your hands, all in the hopes for one goal, for really just one moment. All to have that moment taken away from you. And what's left is nothing but the pain and the blood and the memories of all of those you killed on the way. Over time, Einar begins to realize the truth behind Thorfinn's past, that he was a warrior, a Viking, a man no different, really, than those who had killed and burnt down his village. Einar clenches his fist at the memory of their loss, his anger boiling inside of him. Later that night, as the two lie down to go to sleep, Einar begins to replay Thorfinn's words in his mind, remembering the men who had destroyed his village. Slowly, Einar's anger grows as he looks down on the sleeping Thorfinn. With a crazed look in his eyes, slowly Einar reaches out both of his hands, his grip ever tightening around Thorfinn's neck as he begins to choke the life out of the man. Thorfinn begins to struggle, but not at being choked. Thorfinn, you see, is trapped in his own perpetual hell, his own mind. We see a young Thorfinn fighting for his life in a burning woods, being pursued by apparitions of soldiers. He screams out, Einar releasing his grip on the man's throat. It's then that he realizes Thorfinn is being tormented by a nightmare. Thorfinn cuts the warriors down, one by one, until it's too late. As he sinks his blade into the man, he suddenly sees the face of the old English woman, the woman we talked about from season 1. In his dreams, Thorfinn sees a great pit below him. In the pit, thousands of Vikings currently waging war. Even in their death, they continue to fight on, forever spreading their violence. Thorfinn looks down as suddenly he feels a hand grip his leg. To his horror, he sees the souls of the many that he has killed. The people clawing and gnashing, forever pulling him down to atone for his sins. These scenes are some of the most horrific scenes I've seen from really a non-horror anime, really since the last time that I read Berserk. Here in Thorfinn's nightmares, we see these zombie-like forms of Vikings continually fighting to the death. All the while they laugh, this sick laugh of joy at their mutual shared destruction. If this doesn't show you what Yukimura, our author, thinks of violence, then I'm not sure what will. Slowly, Thorfinn begins to climb, the man embracing his agony, embracing his grief, embracing the many lives that he has taken. As he climbs, taking the souls of the people he has killed with him, spurred on by these shouts of Ashkelad, telling Thorfinn to become a true warrior. Like I said earlier, in many ways, Vinland Saga is a story of redemption, and we see this played out through the many differences in Thorfinn and Einar. In Thorfinn's mind, he's lost everything. Having had his family taken from him, his childhood taken from him, having become a cold-hearted murderer, and all in the hopes of gaining revenge, and then just to have it taken away from you. Einar, though, on the other hand, is really not that different from Thorfinn. The man, on 2 different occasions, mind you, saw his home and his family completely destroyed. He had everything and everyone he loved taken from him. He was taken far from home and sold into slavery in a foreign land. Like Thorfinn, he too has lost everything, but the difference is Einar's will to live. The will to live which comes from the sacrifice that others have made. It's really interesting, all of these scenes with Einar and Thorfinn, in many ways they're the same. Yet one of the biggest differences is that Einar is not a warrior. He's a farmer. He's not taken another human life. But in his anger, we see him compelled to. He feels that want for revenge that we saw drive Thorfinn to do horrible things. That cyclical violence that we as humans are ever plagued by. And we see Einar almost pushed to that same level. Yet, he stops as he sees that Thorfinn, even in his own dreams, continually suffers for the actions that he's done. What are men like Thorfinn and Einar to do in a world dominated by violence? Thorfinn is tormented by his past actions, the many lives he's taken in his quest for vengeance, which ultimately left him with nothing. Before Thorfinn can truly live again, the man must find a way to forgive himself. It's in this moment, Thorfinn realizes his true path, the one of non-violence, as he vows to find a safe place, a land untouched by war and violence, in which to live. Violence, though, is unescapable, even in a place like Ketil's farm, as reports slowly begin to come in one day that another servant on a nearby farm has escaped. This servant is Gardar. Before he was captured, Gardar lived a happy life with his wife and his son, yet their entire lives were changed by war and violence, as Gardar would be captured in battle and sold into servitude, losing contact with his wife and his son. The man would be driven by anger and sorrow, slowly becoming a mindless weapon of violence and destruction. Gardar, in many ways, embodies the world of Vinland Saga and the message of the corruption of violence. Through Arnhard's memories, his wife, we see Gardar as a lovely man, this loving father and husband who really only ever wanted what was best for his family. But war changed all of this. Now Gardar is really more of a beast than a man, driven to reclaim the one he loved and his former family, not even knowing that his son is dead. Gardar is a man driven by rage, longing for rest and peace, which sadly he can only find in his death, an eternal escape from this horrible world. This theme is repeated multiple times throughout our story. Gardar, in many ways, parallels the escaped slave, the one we saw all the way back in episode 1 of the show. Both of these men knew pain and suffering in their lives. Both of these men had their freedom and family taken from them, their lives shaped by violence and war, and both would find peace only in death. An unfortunate reality of this world that Thorfinn realizes. Why is it that the only peace these men can find is in death? Death is the only escape from the violent reality. But what if there were another option? What if there was a place free from all of the violence? A beautiful place of natural resources and beauty, far away from the warring of the Vikings. A place like Vinland. Before we continue on with our story and Thorfinn, I want to highlight a couple of other characters that make their appearances in Season 2. The farm owner Ketil and his 2 sons, Olmar and Thorgil. The Ketil family themselves are a extremely interesting analysis of violence in this world of Vinland Saga. First, you have Ketil, the father, a supposed renowned Viking warrior. However, in reality, he was just a normal man who happened to share the same name with a famous Viking warrior, and thus he would assume the man's identity. He's no more of a warrior than Einar, yet in this world of violence, might makes right, and so does the fear and respect of violence itself. Next is the eldest son, Thorgil, the embodiment of this Viking culture, this culture of violence. Thorgil is a skilled warrior and former bodyguard to King Canute, a man obsessed with war and violence and honor, who believes that really nothing else matters besides a man's strength and his performance on the battlefield. Finally, we have the youngest son, Olmar, the exact opposite of Torgal in almost every way. Olmar is a young man who wishes to be a warrior, who wishes to be like his elder brother, but upon experiencing violence firsthand and even taking life, Olmar's mind is completely shattered. He realizes that this life his brother lives, the life that he has idolized since he was just a child, is horrible. It's disgusting. It's a dreadful thing, and the prospect of any more killing completely terrifies him. The scope of our story begins to open a lot broader as we see the King Canute is no longer the scared young man we saw in Season 1. Hardened by battle and by the weight of the crown, Canute has become obsessed with his grand vision, his vision to build a paradise on Earth for his Viking people, and he will stop at nothing to achieve these ends. Realizing he will need even more resources, Canute decides to use his army to reclaim private farms in his land. Beginning with one of the more fruitful farms, Ketil's. On the farm, the recently returned Ketil and his sons prepare for battle. These three men and their followers must face down Canute and his mighty Joms Vikings. The outcome of this battle was really never in doubt. Ketil's forces largely composed of commoners and farmers, mixed with a few mercenaries and skilled warriors. Though they outnumber the Joms Vikings, these simple men with no training never stood a chance against such battle-tested warriors. Before the fight, Torgal explains this to his younger brother Olmar, telling him that these men's death will serve as a distraction while he and his brother swim around the ocean to flank and kill the king. Just as Torgal predicted, soon the green countryside was stained with an unholy crimson. The air began to stink with the smell of death as bodies were strewn across the field. Suffering countless casualties, Ketil's forces begin to break as they commit a full-out retreat, dropping their weapons, running. In the chaos, Torgal springs into action, attacking King Canute, who just barely manages to repel his strike. Torgal being forced to flee as the King's Guard rush to his aid. All of that death and bloodshed, that great sacrifice for just one moment to kill the king, was all for naught. Meanwhile, amidst the chaos, Leif Erikson is preparing a boat to flee with Thorfinn and Einar. But suddenly, Thorfinn realizes there's something that he must do. The battle isn't over yet. Ketil and his family still live after they retreated. Bloodshed is very much still on the horizon. And though Thorfinn and Einar's freedom is right at their fingertips, Thorfinn refuses, feeling duty-bound to speak to the king in an attempt to stop the fighting. Back in the farmer's camp, Olmar is breaking at the sight of so much violence and death. Here, Torgal and the others debate on whether or not to surrender or to mount one last stand against the king. Torgal's opinion is, well, rather obvious. He wants one last glorious fight, one last glorious stand. The man sees no other way but violence. But surprisingly, it's not his decision to make. Ketil had named his younger son Olmar as his heir. Olmar, here for the very first time, it seems has some conviction, as he tells his family that they will surrender to the king. His mother immediately chastises him, saying, "Surrender? Doesn't that embarrass you as a Norseman?" Olmar simply replies, "I'm scared. I'm scared of people dying. I'm scared I might die. My actions have brought this upon all of us, and I will take the consequences." Torgal attempts to talk some sense into his younger brother, but we see for the first time that Olmar's conviction is strong, as he tells him mindless violence isn't courage, it's foolishness, as he makes the decision to surrender to King Canute. For this entire second season, we've seen Ketil's mission is to turn his son Olmar into a man, into a Viking man. This idea of a strong Norseman, a man who fights for his honor and seeks a warrior's death, pursuing wealth at the cost of life and through the bite of cold steel. And it's here, in this moment, amidst all of the chaos, through everything, that Olmar finally does become a man. He becomes a true warrior, a person who is willing to make the hard decision, a person not clouded by meaningless honor and this thirst for bloodshed. Meanwhile, Thorfinn has finally made his way to the battlefield, telling the king's warriors that he is an emissary from the farm, who had once actually served the king in his bodyguard, and he would like to seek peace. The warriors, though, only seeing Thorfinn as just this small, feeble man, really a servant at that, attempt to send Thorfinn away, but he refuses. One of them, believing that he can beat some sense into our man Thorfinn, begins punching him over and over and over again. Thorfinn decides to risk it all, to bet on himself. No, literally, he makes a bet with the other warriors that if he can survive 100 punches from this big-ass Viking warrior, that he will be allowed to go see the king. In one of the most brutal scenes I've seen in an anime in a long time, we watch Thorfinn slowly be beat to an unrecognizable pulp. This man who at one point was this ball of violence and rage, a cold-hearted killing machine, who most likely probably could have bested every single man here, began to take this brutal punishment, being struck again and again and again, over and over. Yet still he stands, resolute in his goal, in his mission for non-violence. Nearly unconscious on his feet, his face all but recognizable, Thorfinn has done it. And with these 100 strikes, he had earned these Vikings' respect. The man who had dealt the punishment apologizing to Thorfinn, telling him that you are a true warrior, Thorfinn, son of Thors. When asked why Thorfinn refused to strike back, Thorfinn responds passionately, "You are not my enemy. We just met. I have no enemies." It's here we see the parallels between Canute and Thorfinn. Both wish for a world free of violence. Both wish for a paradise here on Earth, a place that's safe from senseless death and bloodshed. But it's through their actions that the two differ. Thorfinn, through his tragic early years, has learned that peace cannot be achieved through violence like this. To him, it just is a senseless circle, a snake forever eating its tail. Violence will always beget more violence, and it's only through non-violent practices that a paradise could be formed. In a surprise turn of events, King Canute leaves Ketil's farm, the two men creating a very unlikely alliance, joined together in their goal to create this paradise. Thorfinn wishes to create a world apart from violence, apart from the reality they live in. A world for people who seemingly's only salvation in this world is death, as we've seen with Arnhard, Gardar, and even the slave, like we said, all the way back from episode 1 in the first episode of the series. This is the world that Thorfinn wishes to build. These are the people he wishes to build it for. He wishes to create an escape, one that's simply not death. And it's just really powerful stuff. And in a lot of ways, it kind of fucked me up, if I'm being completely honest. This is the story that Yukimura is trying to tell us. This is the reason Vinland Saga is so brutal in its displays of violence. Yukimura truly does detest violence, but it's only through this raw brutality that we see the horrors for what it really is, instead of something that people try to make it out to be. This message is still extremely true today in 2023. Humans have this unfounded capacity for violence to deploy against one another. We seem to exist in a cycle where we can't help but find reasons to kill each other, creating this dark world where many feel that their only escape is in their death. Thorfinn must go through this darkness in order to emerge in the light. Like his father before him, he was forced to endure the cold reality of war, of violence, of death. Only through this experience can Thorfinn understand what it means to be a true warrior. A warrior who is able to defeat his enemies without violence. A warrior who fights to make peace, not through war. As like Thor said, to truly eliminate your enemies, one must realize that you have no enemies. And sometimes it takes getting hit in the face willingly 100 times to prove your point. This to me is really what Vinland Saga is all about. The human experience. It's dark and gritty. We have people have capacity to commit horrible acts of violence. This violence only leading to this endless cycle of revenge that's really plastered all across our history. But it's through this loss and this horror, we can strive for something more, something better. We can strive to live our lives like Thorfinn, as true warriors. And this, my friends, is why Vinland Saga is so much more than just an anime. As always, my fellow friends and weebs, if you did enjoy the video, please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Why don't you consider sharing it as well if you did enjoy it, as this video took a long time for me to make, and I really would appreciate it. As always, friends, until next time, stay safe out there. Peace, love, adu.